people around you and you tell them that you made a small step forward and they make light of it or are cynical about it or punish you for it, they might think very hard about just who it is that you're hanging around. Because you want to be with people who know your progress forward
Udari ga
and
lopatom.
at least don't get in the way.
Vidi ja zaražen sad, evo.
There may be
Ne
some
budi zaražen,
cleaning up
čovječe.
of the chaos in your past you have to do, right? And you can note that. Imagine you have a goal, getting a new job, and
Sad moramo debeloga
you see
ubijati.
that there are obstacles in
Kako
your
ćemo?
path.
Ako ja tak, ja treba bombe ove uzeti, taj, ja da ne, koliko su dobre ovi granatle, ovi dobro ju.
Da. Pa ništa, treba ponijeti sa sobom onaj, ako imaš u inventariju. Ja imam 20-30 granatica, ono, svačega
Imam
nešto.
oko 40-50 komada, nemam pojma.
Čega, bom puskla da
Ja.
bombe tu. Nama bolju za bombom.
To treba za 15. stage sada, znači.
Maybe you're not sophisticated enough to conduct yourself well in a job interview, but that's something you can learn. Write down 40 questions that you think you might be asked. Come up with an answer, not a lie, but an answer.
A stav ovdje je sve otvoreno.
Let's say you lie your way into a job.
Nije sve.
You didn't get the job.
Nije sve.
The lie got the job. And if you had to lie to get the job,
Ajde, Bog te punu.
so then you're rewarded if you get a job that isn't for you and that you don't deserve. So that's how you're going to start a job. You know, why don't you start a job that is for you, that you do deserve, that you could do? That'd be a lot better. Right? And you might say, well, I have to get a pretty dismal job. You start where you are, or you start on a falsehood. And one of the things,
Ma nije ovdje bili.
phenomena in economics,
A sad će
called the
biti.
Matthew principle.
Ne ide odmah na početku, nego malo kada se opustiš. Evo i.
Everything with it. This is a reflection of economics called the Pareto distribution. And the Pareto distribution is like this. Progress is not linear. It's geometric or exponential. Once you start accruing money, the probability that
Zelenoga treba ubiti.
this is why a very small percentage of people have all the money.
Ja dobijem.
You have no money. It's hard to make it
Raptor.
back.
Yes.
It's a lot easier to make the next million than it is to make the first. And that's the
Aj tucite njega, ja ću u ove male.
it's much easier to record the next than it was to record the first. And the third is even easier than the second. Success builds upon itself. And so what that means
Popni se.
slow. And even if you have to take a job that's beneath
Jel, šamaramo.
10 sekundi imamo.
you should be grateful for it. The job having that job and push you along is extremely high. People who are bitter and hold back undergraduates come to work with me in my lab, and I had a lot fewer positions than there
Ide
were
sačma u ugla.
hiring undergraduates, right? So they were high demand
Koliko
positions.
napraviš?
And generally what I would do was
No
give
po 4000, al ono više ima.
Aha, kad ih ima više.
A ne znam koliko je sad ono u globalu je.
Da. Ja ću ostaviti mašinku ovdje, nek ubija sve redom, a za ovoga vidjet ćemo kako će ići.
Are talking with someone who has resources that you might want access to if they ask you to do something.
Evo šta, 3 mašinke na jednom mjestu i gotovo.
That's an opportunity. And if you have the
Pa ja, brate, 3 mašinke tu, stati to je tu.
Ona ga dropi sve, znači redom, znači njega i njih ostale. Ono da ga ja tamo zaglavljivam, ne smatram da mi potrebno to.
Da promijenim svjetla na mišu. Ne morat ću ja vratiti onaj stari miš.
Nemoj
Da mogu
vratiti
mladiti po njemu.
Eno domaćina odmah. Idemo, prvi je pao. Daj sljedećega.
Leđa. Leđa.
Ja leđa.
Ko je trica? A bot. A tvoja leđa.
Ovo te papa.
Sljedećega.
To mi je ovo blicno kada me kamera slika.
And if you produce an increment of celery of this magnitude, or give me a bit more flexibility or other opportunity, here's a bunch of things
Opa.
that would make your life even better. It's like, if you have that story and material, and you present that to your employer, and they don't go, you know, that sounds like a pretty damn good deal. Are you sure that that raise is enough? Then maybe you should decide whether or not that's what the right thing to do is. You might have already wanted to get your CV in order and to start sending it out, see what sort of market demand there is for these skills, so you can tell
Mislim da ga imamo, a?
that you have other offers that are closing. And then you put yourself in a good market. Part of the reason, by the way, that women do not make one of many reasons is that they're not as good at promoting their own accomplishments.
To.
Right? It's part of being agreeable and higher in negative emotion. I saw this when I worked in civil service in Alberta years ago when I was a kid.
Jel vi... Ja, ima još jedna,
I
ja.
saw that the bureaucracy
Da.
was basically run by 50
A dobro smo
people
ovo taktički, jer, brate, ti oko njega, ja i Boki čistili.
Aj tamo ga, znači ovako se boss ubiva. Kad budemo na Brutusa išli isto ćemo ovako.
Ja ljudi nemam za machine gun.
Šta?
Nemam
Ne,
kešu.
ne veze, baci bombu jednu, znači i gotovo je. Samo rokaj.
Ja ću brzo trebati ići. Jeboja maj, sam sve za...
Gdje će ići?
Moram ići po.
A dobro, ne moraš ni pit vode svaki dan, idi popivo, pusti vod na miri.
Aha. Treba sve matera skuvat kavu.
Maybe you're conscientious enough so that that'll be sufficiently motivating. But most of us would like to be rewarded for a job well done on some schedule. That's something else you can negotiate with kids. One of you in America...
Neko treba ove ubijeti.
Discover about yourself. Well, schedule is necessary. That's not a good reward schedule. And something to discover. Maybe someone only has something to have to say something about it like once every month. Who knows? Or maybe it's twice a day. There's going to be some temperamental variability that characterizes you in that regard. Notice do you need when you're doing something good? And this is something you negotiate with your partner when you do something for them. You can
Ne.
Mislim da te ubio.
and you can also let them know what they need to say.
Joj.
I bot preživio, malo.
Say you're having a
A, ti se nisi vrat, truđu.
Neće vrat.
A ja...
Mora ti izdržati.
Ma nema šans.
Sam ti ubivaj ove ostale.
What do you want me to say? Well, if you loved me, you'd know. Right. Everyone everyone laughs when I make that joke. Yeah, well, it's too vague. It's like, no, I want to know exactly what you would want to say. Like, if I could say to you what would make you happy, now you're in trouble because you have to figure that out, right? And then you have to reveal that. And then you're going to be annoyed because you're going to say, well, that's not true. But yeah, maybe it won't be the first 20 times. Right, but maybe the person can get good at it, and by the 50th compliment, not only will they have the words right, but they'll also have the sentiment right. How they're treating you well to begin with. If your partner does do something,
Pa ja tebe ne mogu ni oživjeti, bo.
Evo.
you know, this is how you greeted me when I came home. I got a hug, for example, instead of an immediate litany of never-ending complaints. Like, that was a very lovely way to re-enter the house. If you're this is something that's very useful with employees too and co-workers. If you see someone doing a good job, you say, hey,
Evo ga, squito.
here's what you did. I saw that.
A, ne više mašinki.
You do that 100 times.
Maš, jesi naručio šta?
Bombe.
Bacaj bombe.
Pa evo, ne vlačim mi.
Ja.
Evo s popusale.
Fuck.
Train animals to do anything. He trained pigeons to guide guided missiles over enemy territory by pecking on photographs. That's hard. Skinner noticed that reward was the most effective form of behavioral transformation, but it was subtle because to reward an animal
Evo i ja sam mrtav.
for doing something you want it to do, you have to wait
A ima
around
60
until it
sekundi,
does
znači
something.
previše ih je sada.
Right, and so this is the same in your household. If you're watching
I
your kids,
dvojica
maybe your
imaju.
kid by accident cleans something up
Ništa,
one
vrti
day.
se samo okolo malo.
You can notice that. You say, look, you know, maybe they're 5. That was the sort of thing an 8-year-old would do. You know, good work, kid. Here's what you did.
Joj, skoči levat, ne meni od.
A ja.
The probability that they'll do something like that again radically magnifies. And kids are very good at generalizing too, you know. So not only will they do that again, but they'll do things in that category again. Right, and that's a fun way of interacting with people in your family, because targeted reward is a pleasure to receive, and so it's a great way of establishing harmony without
Boki nas je za pogibao.
Pa jes. Ne može ovdje, znači mora četvorca koja igraju nešto.
Još jednu.
Ma ne, ima to, bježi bavi. Šta ćeš još jednu kad ne možeš ovo da riješiš, znači ove ostale...
Džinja zajebu.
Džabaj.
Tako već tačno, kad god preživi on pogine u letu.
Pa ja.
Jebi. Desi se i najgori on, pa ime.
Neću više ni igrat se, znači ovo, jebeš to. Pa ne, sekcija 15, ako ne možemo to da riješimo, ako nismo sve četvorca, ako nema 4 igrača, nema potrebe pokušavati, igramo 10-10 i odradimo 3 po 10 danas i čao zdravo.
9.
Evo riješio,
Ne može 10,
talk
11,
max,
12 može.
talk max, talk ovaj, talk onaj.
Why are you gay? Gay.
Gay, good guy.
Znači 3 puta dnevno možeš uzeti nagradu i to je to.
Čisti Makse, brate moj, šta ima u tebe? Horror tunel. Imaš šta da prodati, imaš. Dobro, ajde, kupujemo, sve kupujemo, prodajemo. Čisti skup, jarane. I na njega izgleda rat u Iranu utiče.
Pa da.
Your failure to confront the mess on your computer might end your life.
Dobro, opet sam se vratio na 5.000.
Čega?
Na para. Bio sam spao kume Na 100.000.
Nemoj spast na 100.000.
There are forces behind the scenes that are moving you. You have no idea what they are.
160 lekcija imam u ovom
Primary
vozu.
cry
A nijedna
of
nisam
our
pojel.
time is for a uniting narrative.
Šta sam ono sada
The
mislio?
hero's narrative defines the foundation of things.
Je, otišao sam, dođem brzo.
It's the story.
Ajde,
One
ajde,
of the things that a
rekao
great
si.
story does is that it reveals
Ubija.
truths that have
Ide.
been known
Ideš i
since
ti.
the beginning of
Ajde,
time.
Neću još.
That's a map. Time to wake up.
Ja odo onda
Develop a
pobiti
vision of
cvijeće
your own
i odo i ja
destiny.
pa ću
The
doći
right
kasnije.
map
Koliko je
represents
sada?
the journey
4
that you want to
4 p.m.
take. The bigger dragon you confront, the more potential will be released within you. Who knows who you could become? In this course, you're going to go through the chaos to the promised land. The meaning of the journey justifies the risk. You're going to take all the risks there are. Choose which ones to take. You're pursuing something of maximal value. A sense of meaning. It's a representation of dynamic transformation. To believe something. Stake your life on it. The worst of all things will come your way. Face that, prevail. So it turns out that there are two fundamental ways of looking at the world. And in the modern Western world, we've decided that one of them is primary. I think we picked the wrong one. So what are the two ways of looking at the world? You can think about what the world is made of. Say, you can think about that from the perspective of experience, or as a materialist, you can think about what the world is made of, or you can think about how to act in the world. And since you're alive, figuring out how to act in the world is arguably of primary importance and perhaps a primary reality. Now, action is more than how you navigate in the world, moving, let's say, because your perception is also action predicated. So, for example, when you look at the world to find out what it is, you have to direct your attention. And that happens many ways. It happens unconsciously. There's all sorts of from your eyes back. You're moving your eyes constantly. When you look at something, you're not a passive observer. You're an active observer. There's no perception without action. There's no primary sense data about what the world is without action. You're lost framework action, even at the level of attention. Now, you know this to some degree. If you're in a restaurant, you forget about vision. Well, if you're in a restaurant and you're sitting with your guests, you pay attention to them, perhaps the waiter and the waitress, and not the rest of the people in the cafe, generally speaking, unless something strange happens. There's many things you could look at, but you direct your attention to what? To what's of import. So you're focusing always on what's relevant and what commands center stage. And so the question is, what commands center stage and why? Now, in order to act in the world and to attend to the world, you have to frame your perception. And the reason you have to frame your perception is because there's an indefinite number of things to attend to. So if you were painting this wall, that's a great choice. Perhaps it's not. This is a very featureless wall. Although if you attended to it very carefully, you'd see that there were gradations of shade and light. The photorealist who was attending to it would find out that although, for example, that there would be very light, there's an infinite amount of detail around it. Face, an array of faces in a crowd, drowned in detail. You have to focus. You focus your attention. And the question is, or a question is, what
Lol, uspio sam.
structure
Pa
do you
nešto.
use
Aha,
to
Pa
focus
šta?
your attention.
Nešto što se nisam nadao.
Sequence the actions that
Opa.
underlie your perceptions in relationship to a goal. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what I've got here first is a simple frame of perception. And
Ovaj klinac sačekaj.
consists of
Da si uspio?
three
Šalte.
parts.
Ma da dignem na 6. level
You
ovaj
have a
pa.
sense of where you
Pa
are.
cijel,
Aha.
ovo će se pravi.
Situated somewhere because you're in
Opa.
I sad imam
headed somewhere
ovaj,
as well. And then you have to strategize and organize your
a
attention on
nešto,
your actions in order to move you
adjust,
from
tako
the
se
place
kaže,
of
Adjust.
action to the place that you want.
adjust.
Now,
To je, da.
the
Na
framework
Forge
that
adjust.
you use to
Ja.
evaluate
To
your
crvena
attention
oružja se
as
to
that
adjustaju.
structure. So,
Pa šta radi, me smijem listovati, ovo smijem.
Pa smiješ, substatove mu
starting with Norbert Wiener
popravljaš.
back in 1940, worked on missile control systems.
No, rekao, šta ne sjede?
Founder of missile. You have a beginning place, you have a trajectory of the missile that predicts the trajectory. You have to organize the machinery so that it decreases the gap between the projectile and the target until the target is hit. That's the cybernetic viewpoint. Phenomenology, starting with Huss, Heidegger,
A tu sam bio zaglavio oko toga, brate, nisam se mogao da ga napatim. Neku glupost.
materialist, reductionist, atheist view of reality. And he hypothesized that our fundamental sense of what was most real had gone astray, especially after the dawn of the scientific revolution, with its concentration on its insistence that the material substructure was the most real phenomena. Phenomena means to shine forth. It's from the Greek word phanesthai. So it means in a way what presents itself. The burning bush in the story of Exodus, that's a phenomena. Something that grabs your attention, right? That captivates you or compels you to
Hvala takođe.
listen or watch or consider or follow or imitate. That's a phenomena. As you make your way through the world, things shout out to you, command your attention, and make themselves relevant in relationship to your aims. So if you're planning a pleasant interlude with a family member and they throw a curveball into the affair, then that phenomenon stands forth in your field of experience as relevant and negative. And it's negative because it deviates from your intended goal. Throughout your life, you're perfectly happy when something negative happens. So that's a foreshadowing of something we're going to related. Emotion is experience, relationship, to a goal. Positive emotion indicates you're moving towards the goal. Negative emotion indicates that something has gone astray. Like the system that I described earlier. This is unhappy as it deviates from the course. Your emotions are trajectory adjustment system. Positive indicates forward movement and validates the frame of perception. Negative emotion indicates deviation from the path. So keep that in mind. That have ever been published in terms of their quality of content, also the production values are high quality university level education for under 2,000.
Idemo, crveni itemi.
Cybernetics, phenomenology.
Bomba crvena.
Psychologists began to sort this out in the 20th century as well, not least with the observation that there was no perception independent of action.
A gdje pucaš, Bog te?
Imagine that you're blind and you're using your fingers to put
A
together
ništa
a
odu ja.
composite sensory picture
Ide,
of
ajde pa
someone's
se čujemo
face.
kasnije kad dođete.
That's exactly what you do with your eyes. Spot, 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 composite. And there's a foreground that's fovea dependent. The fovea is the center point of your eye. It's the high resolution part of your vision. It requires much more neurological processing than the periphery. If your entire retina was foveal, you'd need a cortex that was many times larger to process it. You maximize the use of available neurological resource by pinpointing the fovea and intensely concentrating on the particular point of interest. Around your fovea, which is very high resolution, the world becomes lower and lower and lower resolution until out here you're seeing in black and white, and back here there's nothing, not even the sense of absence, right? So center point focus on what's relevant and important in relationship to a goal, surrounded by a periphery that disappears into what? Into, you could say, the void, if you're using poetic terminology. That'll be relevant as we start to understand the structure of stories. That's a cybernetic frame. It's a phenomenological frame. Now, the phenomenologists Husserl and Heidegger redefined reality itself. And the reason they were doing that, there were two reasons. They were concerned that the divide between object and subject that had been set up as a consequence of the scientific and Enlightenment revolution prioritized the objective and left the subjective in an abyss of uncertainty and meaninglessness, in part because it was defined away. The subjective became epiphenomenological on a more fundamental reality. Now, that's an existential problem because we can't live in a universe that's devoid of all meaning but suffering, let's say. And it's perverse because there's no perception without a subjective observer. And if you contemplate the situation scientifically, even, let's say, the basic sense data that the empiricists believe that the world is made of is dependent for its existence on perception. Perception is dependent on action, and action is dependent on goal. Goal is dependent on value. And so the notion of objective subset of existence in the absence of a perceiver who's embedded in the world of value and meaning is not even from a scientific perspective, partly because we have that question. Now, the phenomenon tries to solve that subject-object divide problem, and the nihilism or valuelessness that emerges in the scientific worldview are prioritizing not objective reality, but experience as such. So you're sitting in this lecture theater, you have a focus of attention, that's why the theater is built to make your entrance, how you're supposed to conduct yourself. The chairs are all facing in a particular direction. They converge on a point. The point is the point of the lecture. The point is the point of your attention. The point is the goal of your attention, right? That all organizes your perceptions. It foregrounds some things, at least in principle, when you're not thinking or distracted, what I'm saying or the slides that I'm using. And that renders everything else increasingly irrelevant as it diverges from the central point. And so there's a foreground. Generally, when you're interacting with someone, the foreground of your attention is their face, and even more specifically, their eyes, and even more specifically, their pupils. And you do that so you can see what they're pointing to, because you can tell what they're interested in. You can tell what they're compelled by. You can read emotions through the eyes. Our eyes are adapted Evolution has adapted our eyes to make them maximally visible, colored black against a white background, so that when we interact with people, we can see what their point is. Having seen their point, we can inhabit their frame of reference, we can infer what's meaningful to them, we can adopt their emotions, we can mimic those emotions on our own body, and that's how we understand them. Our face is a value display system, right? And when you're concentrating on someone, you almost always look at their eyes. We're very, very good at that. Even from a distance, you can detect small deviations in someone's eye gaze direction, because understanding the object of their intention and attention is the most important thing you can derive. You're focused here on what I'm saying, you're watching my face, you're watching my eyes, the world constructs itself around that. Husserl's fundamental point was that all perception is intentional. It's associated with a goal. It moves towards a point, and that point is related to the insistence that I put forward at the beginning, that our perception is action-oriented, that our problem is navigation. How do we get from point A to point B, from what is currently to what should be? We're always somewhere moving somewhere else. And then there's a gradient, which is why in this diagram there's a slant upward. What's the gradient? Well, if you're aiming up, the gradient is upward, the gradient is uphill, the gradient is from a lesser place to a greater place. Why would you move from what is to what should be if the place you're headed to wasn't better than the place you're at, assuming that you're not engaged in some form of counterproductive self-destruction? So there's a value gradient in perception itself that sets up the landscape for emotion, right? If you're moving from point A to point B, the value of the movement is the distance between the 2 points in relationship to upward aim. Now, the longer the distance, the harder the journey. So that's an energy expenditure problem. You want to foreground a goal that's valuable in relationship to where you are, that doesn't require more energy than you have at hand. Now, you can sequence goals, and we'll get to that. Okay, what's this frame? It's a cybernetic frame. So cybernetic pioneers and many of the developers of computational systems, especially the robotics engineers who started to understand that you couldn't do robotics computation without embodiment, the phenomenologists, the psychologists of perception have all converged on a notion that we inhabit a frame of perception that organizes the world around us, that has a goal in mind. The last thing you need to know about that to begin with is that's a story. That's a story. So the postmodernists insisted that we inhabit a story. They dispensed with the notion that there was a central unifying story that was common to all places and all times, let's say, but they insisted, and correctly so, that even the scientific enterprise is nested inside a story. What's the scientific story? We're making things better. Otherwise, it's an evil scientist story, and there's plenty of them too. And we might say that the true science is the science that serves what? Mankind, the good of mankind, and it's an upward journey, and that's not built into the scientific enterprise itself. It's the a priori frame that the scientist has to inhabit so that they aren't a threat, right? That's the case, you could say, for everything that you do. If any of your actions are predicated on an ultimately downward aim, then you're an agent of chaos, right? At minimum. A story. What's a story? A story is a description of a frame of perception. Now, think about this when you go to a movie. Think about what you're doing. So you see a sequence of subplots. And in the subplots, you see the characters in motion. You see them directing their attention. You infer their goals from their speech and their patterns of action. You put that together as a pastiche across multiple instances, and you draw your conclusions about the aim and direction of the character. Having done that, you can adopt that frame. Having adopted the frame, you see the world through the perspective of the protagonist, and you experience his or her emotions, right? You do that to experiment with a frame of perception with no risk, right? Some emotional risk. There's enough enthusiastic impetus in the imitation so that even if you're watching a horror movie that would expose you to phenomena that normally would be aversive, placing yourself in the fictional frame and experimenting with the exposure is sufficiently motivating in the positive direction so that you'll pay for the privilege, right? Why is fiction so important? Why are we so compelled by stories? Because a story is a description of the manner in which we frame our perception, our attention, and our action. So there's a viewpoint that makes the story not secondary, not laid upon another more fundamental reality, but a priori. Now, there's obviously an interplay that has to occur between our understanding of how the world is constituted and how we should act in it. But the notion that there's a simple primacy of material being seems at minimum seems half true and rife with conceptual flaws. The simplest frame, the simplest story. You ask a toddler, a kindergartner, what did you do today? I went to school with Mom. Started at home, I went to school, that was the sequence. I went to school with Mom, and on the way, a scary dog jumped at the fence and barked, and I got afraid, and we thought about going home, but we decided not to, and we continued forward. That's a little hero story. That's a disruption of the frame by an unexpected event, and then its reconfiguration, even at a higher level, because the kindergartner in that instance, in principle, discovers a courage to move forward.
Uj, vidi, već su tu govori. Jeste?
Ili otišli?
That's a micro
Ili je ti-
hero narrative.
Ma ja odeše da jedu, odeše po vodu, odeše na iftar, odeše svugdje.
The simplest story is I was here, I went there, and this is
Yeah.
how I did it.
I ja isto, evo sada
More
bossa
complex
odigram,
story
ode i
is
ja.
I was here,
Ma ja idem
I
sada
was
šišam,
going there,
taman.
and the
Odigraš
bottom
bossa,
fell
ideš
out.
šišaš se
And
posle
then I
toga.
went
Ne mogu
somewhere else,
15 do
put myself
15 do
back
5 mi je
together,
zakazao.
and I got into
Nemoj
the frame,
zezati,
and
pa
away
gdje
I
ćeš to
went.
sada?
Je,
Gledaj sad ovo,
That's a
znači moraš
story
gledati,
about
znači,
how
u parni broj, znači 12:30, 12:40, 2:40, 4:40, ne smiješ to više sebi dopuštati da
A
si
jevi
dalje
ga, sutra ćemo opet.
Zajebavam se, znači, kako da je bitno.
Ma da.
Juče ja otišao sa igrice, Bobiki me zove za 15-20 minuta, kaže on evo bossa, ma jebeš bossa, čuvaj zdravlje.
Ma da.
Nema šta, znači, samo lagano. Idi se ošišaj, pa kad se vratiš, onda ćemo.
Da, pa ima onaj u pola 9. Pola 9.
Pa ja, 8 i da.
Da. Aman, dok sve.
That imbues the frame of your experience with significance. You can imagine sitting, not doing anything, imagining, which is a form of action, running variant possibilities through your mind, experimenting with a sequence of different aims, evaluating the manner in which the emotional landscape shifts as you portray different fictional outcomes in an attempt to experiment with determining what course you should chart before you implement it in the real world. That's a dream. That's what dreams do. The more radical and improbable and incomprehensible dreams shift the elements of your framework of perception so dramatically that you can't necessarily explicitly understand the transformation. We'll talk more about that. You start at what is, with its insufficiency. You move towards what should be. That's the value proposition. Why expend energy if the goal doesn't have value? If you expend energy towards goals that have no value, you die. Right. Honeybees, when they go out and find a flower bed, they come back and they signal to the other bees the navigation pathway to the flower bed, indicating by their level of enthusiastic movement the richness of the store of value. That's exactly what people do when they get excited when they tell you a story. They signal by their willingness to expend energy in the telling that the destination is worth the effort, right? That's a stable means of representing value, treasure, all the way from insects to human beings, right? So if you see a speaker who's pouring out energy in the exposition of their story, then you understand that they believe that the destination is worth the investment of energy. And that's compelling to you because your proposition would be, how could he possibly continue to expend energy if the destination wasn't of sufficient value, right? So that's why enthusiasm, which is positive emotion, and also the state of being possessed by the divine, entheos, is enthusiastic, right? Which would imply that the ultimate goal is the goal that fills you with enthusiasm, right? Which is a way actually of determining within the confines of your own framework of experience what it is that has intrinsic meaning to you. Because if you posit a goal, you see a goal, a possible future, and you frame your perception in a manner that produces no forward moving impulse, which is positive emotion, then you have no heart for the adventure. And so one of the ways that you investigate the structure of your own psyche or your own unconscious or your own being or being itself is by evaluating frames that switch goals until your emotions signify to you that the pathway is worth walking down. Now it's more complicated than mere acquisition. There's going to be some risk along the way, which you want. You want that risk because you want to pick a goal that not only provides you with something that you recognize deeply as significant, but that transforms you as you pursue it so that your capability to posit and pursue better goals increases. That's what you do when you play, right? You don't want it easy. You don't want it impossible. You want it challenging. You want it adventurous. You want it difficult. How difficult? That's what you're to determine. As difficult as possible while maintaining maximal enthusiasm. That's what children do when they play. That's what you do when you're playing. That's what you do when you engage in a game. If you're proficient at generating frames of play or story, then
Dusk Garden
you
uđi,
maximize
završi
enthusiasm
i
and
idemo da se
developmental
vratimo.
transformation simultaneously. Right, that's a good deal. That means that you're playing a game that's worthwhile, that gets better as you play it. Right, that's an upward, that's a Jacob's ladder, by the way. That's a stairway to heaven. Right, exactly. That's a stairway to heaven. A spiral upward that moves into the ineffable good that communicates with the earth, that lays out a pathway upward. And your nervous system itself is tuned. This is an indication of the fundamental reality of these frames. Your nervous system itself is tuned so that what you experience within that frame of reference, when it's optimized, is meaningful motivation. Right. Now, let's think about this scientifically. How would have you evolved the capacity to specify a pathway forward emotionally and motivationally, so biologically, if that wasn't real? Right? If reality is what selects from among the variations that compose life, and reality has selected us to have an experience of deep meaning when we encounter the pathway that leads us upward and transforms us, how is that not real? Right. Simple story. I was here, I did this. What does it mean to do? It means fundamentally to move, right? That's where the rubber hits the road. Words make their embodiment in action. And so you can set a frame abstractly, but you act it out. And when you're acting it out, it's not abstract anymore, right? This is a solution in part to the mind-body problem. You can formulate the frame and the goal abstractly, but when you implement it, you're moving. The movement, that's not abstract. So consciousness, abstracted consciousness, grounds itself in embodied movement. That's the incarnation of the spirit in the corporeal world. That's a way to think about it poetically or religiously, right? You take your abstract conception of the good, or depending on what you're pursuing, and you bring that down, and that's the breath of the spirit by God into man. That's a symbolic representation of that, or the idea of incarnation. That's the same thing. Your goal, your frame, is an active agent. You could think about it as a spirit. Bring that spirit down to earth and embody it. And that's how consciousness transforms itself into action, right? You can infer the abstracted goal of a character by watching their action, right? What's he up to? I'll watch him and see. I'll see how he directs his attention. I'll see towards what he moves or what he avoids, or what he thinks is relevant and what he thinks is irrelevant. I'll infer that frame. You do this to yourself, by the way, and this is something to understand. You have of your frame of reference. You're here to present. So you need that value. You put in the time and effort to come. But why? Why? And then you can tell me, and I can ask, well, why is that important? You could ask, why is that important? That will be the shade up to where you don't know how to answer the question. And that's where your conscious knowledge of your own aims and motivational structure disappear. Sometimes it's the unconscious. It's we'll describe how that works as progress. How is the brain brain? Well, psychology studies perception, attention, emotion, cognition, motivation. Psychologists had a proclivity to describe motivation as drive. And drive theory is behavior that attempts to demonstrate that our actions in us and them were deterministic chains of jerk back, feedback, sense your spine, your motor. It's very fast. Noxious stimuli when it damage the receptive surfaces. That's the definition of noxious. Then you'll withdraw an action, obviously, in the absence of any conscious intent, and extremely rapid. The behaviorists tried to generate a model of motivation that chained reflexes together in increasingly complex manners to account for the kind of sophisticated behavior that animals were capable of, but ultimately failed. B.F. Skinner, who was a outstanding behaviorist, he trained pigeons to direct guided missiles using photographs. And he essentially did that using a process that looked, in a sense, like reflex chaining. If he was going to train a rat to climb a little ladder and then maybe walk across like another ladder that was horizontal and then down, he'd make the rats hungry first. He starved his laboratory animals to 75% of their normal weight so that they were maximally motivated by food. Then he would watch them, and when they moved around the cage and got close to the ladder, the base, he'd give them a food pellet. Then they'd start hanging around the bottom of the ladder. Now and then they'd put a paw up. Then he'd give them another food pellet, and pretty soon they were doing this. And then he could get them to climb up the ladder and to dance on top and to go down the other side. Behaviorists trained rats to run down runways. Let's call that reflex chaining. But then some smart behaviorist, and I don't remember who it was, tied the back legs of a rat up and put it on a cart. And it managed to go down the maze runway with no problem, even though it had never encountered that particular problem before. Animals, human beings with sufficiently complex nerve